My daughter Andrea wept on the phone the week after Frank died. She said she could not stand the thought of me alone in Kingston through February. She said the guest room had a window that looked onto the backyard, Maple, that Piper had already cleared space on the dresser for my things, that supper was at 6, and she would make sure there was always tea. For 4 months, she called every Sunday and sent photographs of the room. She said, "Mum, please, you shouldn't be by yourself." I arrived on a Wednesday in January with 2 suitcases, a carry bag, and one carefully kept secret. By Thursday night, I was sleeping in the sunroom at the back of their house, on a wicker loveseat padded with a quilt that smelled of mildew, while the temperature outside dropped to -14, and cold crept steadily through the glass panels around me. The door into the main house had been locked from the inside. On the floor beside me was a battery lantern and the old BlackBerry I carried in my coat pocket, the one Andrea and Scott did not know about. At 11:30 that night, I typed a message to Mr. Arsenal, the building manager at Harbor Mill Suites in Kingston. "Please prepare the residential suite," I wrote. "I will be returning Friday." He replied within minutes. "Of course, Mrs. Hollis, everything will be ready." My name is Dorothy Hollis. I was 71 years old when my daughter asked me to leave my life and move into hers. What Andrea did not know, and what Scott had been trying to determine since I arrived, was that I could have paid off every debt they owed without opening my primary account. Frank and I spent 34 years building a company called Hollis Commercial Kitchen Supply. We serviced bakeries, school cafeterias, hospital kitchens, and small restaurants across eastern Ontario and into Quebec. Frank understood the equipment, the industrial ovens, the walk-in refrigeration units, the commercial dishwashers that could run 18 hours without a service call. I understood the clients, the contracts, and when a verbal commitment was worth less than the handshake behind it. We started with 1 van and a rented warehouse on Montreal Street. By the time we retired, we had a fleet of service vehicles, a staff of 22, and accounts with 12 hospital networks. A national distributor bought Hollis Commercial 6 years before Frank had his stroke. Between the sale, our investments, and the Harbor Mill Suites property, I had assets worth a little over $4 million Canadian. I did not look like a woman worth $4 million. I drove a 2017 Subaru. I bought my winter boots at Mark's Work Warehouse when they went on sale. I still reused freezer bags until they split. Frank had taught me that carefulness early. In lean years, we had carried the business on careful habits. Those habits did not disappear when the business became comfortable, and Frank had told me, the year before he died, that money changes, once they know the number, he said, they stop hearing your voice. They only hear what they think they're owed. I did not tell Andrea the number. I did not tell her about the Harbor Mill Suites. I kept my Kingston house, my investment accounts, and my building manager's phone number to myself. Frank died on a Tuesday morning in October. He had been reading the Kingston Whig Standard at the kitchen table. He set his coffee mug down carefully as if he knew it would spill, and then he was gone. The house became a different kind of quiet after that. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but the kind with no end. Andrea drove up from Barrie the following day. She brought a lasagne, changed the bed linens, and sat with me through the evening without asking questions. Her daughter Piper, 15, with Frank's way of watching a room before she spoke, sat on the floor and read without pretending to read. I was grateful for both of them. The first time Andrea asked me to move in, I said no. I was not ready to leave Kingston. I was not ready to leave the house where Frank and I had built everything we had. She asked again at Christmas. Then in the new year, each call was gentler than the last. She described the guest room in careful detail, the lighthouse lamp, the morning light through the maple, Piper's drawings on the hall outside. Scott called separately. He said, "Dorothy, we want you here, not to help, just to be here." That sentence made the decision. I wanted to be wanted. I was careful enough to know the difference between what people say and what they mean, but I was also lonely enough that I chose to believe him. Before I agreed, I told them I would not be selling my Kingston house. I said it was tied up in estate paperwork, which was true in the way that is also not entirely true. The house was mine, and I could have listed it the next morning, but I was not willing to close that door. I also said nothing about the Harbor Mill Suites. I was cautious, not suspicious. Cautious. I asked Andrea one question before I accepted. If I come with no money from a sale, no check, no contribution beyond groceries, do you still want me? She looked at me the way she had when she was 8, and I had caught her in a small lie, ashamed, but certain she had good intentions. "Mum," she said, "you are my mother, of course we want you." I gave them $5,000 when I arrived. I called it a contribution to the household and offered to cover my share of groceries and utilities. Scott took the check, thanked me, and deposited it before supper. The guest room in the photographs was not available. Andrea explained that Scott had moved his business files and inventory samples into that room over the holidays because the home office was being used for Piper's school projects. The room would be cleared by the weekend. Scott's landscaping and grounds maintenance company, Ridgeline Property Services, had expanded quickly the previous spring. He had taken on 3 commercial snow removal contracts and hired 4 additional staff. When 2 clients canceled and 1 contract went to a larger firm, Scott's was left with equipment leases, payroll obligations, and a line of credit at the credit union that he was now servicing with the family's home equity line. None of that had been mentioned when they invited me. For the first 2 nights I slept on the pullout in the basement rec room. Just until Friday, Andrea said. Scott is moving the files. Friday came. The guest room still held cardboard boxes along one wall, a folding table covered in purchase orders, and bags of sample materials piled against the window. Scott said he needed 1 more weekend. Saturday afternoon, Andrea's colleague from the school where she worked arrived with a bag. Brenda would be staying for a few nights because her own home was being painted and the fumes were triggering her migraines. Andrea had not mentioned this was coming. We only have the 1 room, Andrea said, and Brenda can't manage stairs easily right now. Where will I sleep? I asked. She gestured toward the back of the house. The sunroom was a 3-season addition. Glass panels on 3 sides, a sliding door that didn't quite seal, tile floor. In July, I imagined it was pleasant. In January, with wind off Georgian Bay finding every gap in the framing, it was the kind of cold that settles into your back and does not leave. Against one wall sat a wicker loveseat with cushions and a folding camp table. The temperature gauge on the wall read 8 degrees Celsius. I looked at Scott. He was looking at the floor. You asked me to live in your home, I said. It's temporary. Brenda needs the room more right now. You're healthy. There it was. My strength, my age, my fitness, my ability to manage had been used to take something from me. I was healthy, and so I would sleep in the cold. Piper appeared in the doorway. She looked at the sunroom, then at me, then at her mother. Grandma can take my room, she said. I'll use my sleeping bag. Andrea shook her head. You have finals coming. You need your own space. Grandma needs a bedroom, Piper said. Scott told her to go upstairs. I said I would take the sunroom. It was not surrender. It was observation. I wanted to see who would correct this and who would let it stand. Andrea brought me an extra blanket and a space heater, which she placed in the corner away from the wall. I know it's not perfect, she said. I'm sorry, Mum. Then, change it. It's just a few nights. She left. The door into the house closed behind her. At 10:30, Piper came to the sunroom with a second blanket and 2 mugs of tea. She sat on the camp table and said, This is wrong. You didn't do it. Dad should have put Brenda in the basement. Something. She looked at her tea. Mum thinks you have a lot of money from the sale of Grandpa's company. I asked what she had heard. Piper was careful with information. She would not say more than she was certain of. But then she told me. Scott had been talking about a family loan arrangement that would consolidate Ridgeline's debt and fund an addition to the house. A proper in-law suite, for me, he had said. But Piper had seen the drawings left open on Scott's laptop. The larger portion of the planned addition was a home office and client meeting room for Ridgeline. The suite labeled for me was a single room barely larger than the basement bathroom. Dad said you'd pay because the room was for you, Piper said, but it's mostly for his business. I asked whether her mother knew. Piper looked at her tea again. She signed the drawings. The cold in the sunroom had not changed, but I felt it differently then. I thanked Piper and asked her to go inside. She squeezed my hand before she left. After midnight, the BlackBerry buzzed. Mr. Arsenault had received a call that afternoon from a real estate agent claiming to represent my family, asking whether the Harbor Mill Suites property might be available and what a preliminary valuation might look like. The agent had given Scott's name. I did not sleep after that. Sunday morning, the inner door was unlocked at 7:15. I had been waiting for the bathroom for 40 minutes. When Andrea opened the door, she looked surprised, as if she had forgotten I was there. At breakfast, Scott placed a folder beside my plate. Inside was a contractor estimate for the addition. The total was $412,000. With your Kingston house sold, you'd have equity to contribute, he said. The property value here goes up. Everyone wins. I reviewed the room labels on the floor plan. Piper had described them accurately. The suite for me occupied less than a quarter of the proposed space. The majority of this is your business office, I said. The office makes the investment viable. Without a proper client space, Ridgeline can't grow. Then Ridgeline should fund Ridgeline. Andrea set down her coffee. Mum, you're sitting on a house you're not living in. The carrying costs alone. I can manage my carrying costs. We're trying to solve a problem for everyone. You're trying to solve a problem for Ridgeline, using the value of my home. Scott's easy smile became something else entirely. You said you wanted to be part of this family. I haven't left. I was asked to sleep in an unheated room. Andrea glanced at Scott. Nobody said anything. Then she said, we rearranged our lives for you. I looked toward the ceiling, in the direction of the guest room that remained full of his purchase orders and sample bags. What did you rearrange? She left the table. Scott said Ridgeline's debt was larger than he had admitted. $180,000 between the credit line and equipment leases. He said the addition would let him run the business properly. Give me a permanent home, help everyone. Did you invite me because you wanted me here? I asked. Or because you needed my Kingston house? He said it wasn't like that. Then he said both things could be true. Then he said he had expected more from me and went inside. That afternoon, I walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and called Mr. Arsenault on the BlackBerry. Please prepare the residential suite for Friday, I said. I will be coming back to Kingston. Of course, Mrs. Hollis, I'll have the pantry stocked. I also called my lawyer, Ms. Lapointe, and asked her to review any recent inquiries connected to Harbor Mill. She called back within the hour. The agent who had contacted Mr. Arsenault had prepared a preliminary valuation. The request had been sent from Andrea's email address. Monday morning, Scott knocked on the sunroom door at 7 to move his truck. When I opened the door, coat already on, suitcase beside the loveseat. He looked uncertain how to adjust his face. We can fix this, Dorothy. Brenda is leaving this afternoon. You can have the basement again. I would like a proper bedroom. The guest room will be cleared by end of week. You said that last Wednesday. He sat on the camp table. Think about what we're offering. A family, people around you, the kids. You can't want to go back to an empty house. The house isn't empty because Frank is gone, I said. The house is mine. That afternoon, the contractor arrived to look at the yard. Scott walked him around the perimeter, gesturing at the back wall. I stepped out of the sunroom into the cold. Excuse me, I said. I understand my name has been connected to the financing for this project. The contractor stopped. I was told the family was contributing toward the build. Mrs. Hollis is named on the estimate as the funding source after the property sale. I have not agreed to fund anything, I said. My Kingston property is not for sale. Please remove my name from any proposal connected to this project. He nodded and stood. He left within 5 minutes. Scott waited until the truck had turned the corner. You humiliated me in front of a professional. I corrected a misrepresentation. You could have spoken to me privately. I did, yesterday at breakfast. He went inside. That evening, Andrea came to the sunroom alone. She sat on the camp table where Piper and Scott had each sat before her. She looked genuinely tired, not performed. I felt something loosen a little in my chest. She was my daughter. Whatever Scott put in motion, she was also a woman carrying more than she had admitted. How much do you actually owe? I asked. She told me. $180,000 on Ridgeline's credit line, plus $47,000 on the HELOC they had drawn to cover the previous year's losses. Why didn't you tell me before you asked me to move in? Because you would have thought that was the reason. It was part of the reason. She looked at the glass panels, at the dark beyond them. Not all of it. Enough of it. She did not argue with that. We sat without speaking. Then she said quietly, Scott reached out to someone about your building, the one on the waterfront. He didn't tell me he was going to do that. She paused. I should have told him not to. Yes, I said. Are you leaving tomorrow? Yes. Where are you going? Kingston. I have a suite there, in the Harbor Mill building. She looked up, a long pause. You own that building. Frank and I bought it 12 years ago. We converted it after the company sale. You never told us. No. She looked out at the dark again. Scott is going to say you planned this, that you hid everything on purpose to catch us. I kept my finances private before Frank ever got sick. Your father's choice and then mine. She cried then. Not dramatically, just the kind of crying that happens when someone has held something too long. I waited until she had finished before I put my hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Mum, she said. I know. I didn't know about the contractor estimate, not the details. You signed the drawings. She flinched. I thought if you were comfortable here, everything would work itself out. My comfort wasn't part of the plan, I said. That's what I needed you to understand. She nodded. She did not argue. Tuesday morning arrived with freezing rain. I was dressed and packed by 6. At 7, Piper appeared in her school jacket. She looked at my suitcase, then crossed the sunroom and hugged me without saying anything. She was taller than she had been at Frank's funeral. She had his way of holding on when she meant it. Scott came out when he heard the van, a small company from Kingston that retrieved the 2 pieces of furniture I had stored in their dining room. He stood on the front step in yesterday's shirt. "Dorothy, we should talk before you do this." "I'm not asking permission, Scott. You're making this into something it isn't." I slept in the sunroom for 4 nights in January. We were crowded. It was temporary. You knew Brenda was coming before I arrived. He looked at his boots. We miscalculated the timing. You miscalculated a lot of things. Andrea came to the door. She looked at the van, then at me. She did not try to stop me. She raised her hand. Not quite a wave, not quite nothing. I got into the car. When we pulled away, Piper was standing at the end of the driveway in the freezing rain without a hat. I watched her in the mirror until the street curved and she was gone. Harbor Mill Suites stood at the edge of Kingston's waterfront district, in a building that had once housed industrial grain equipment, before Frank and I spent 2 years converting it into boutique commercial and residential suites. The stone exterior still had the original loading doors, filled in now with large windows. The Kingston Whig Standard had run a piece on it when we opened. I had never shown Andrea the article. Mr. Arsenault met me at the entrance with an umbrella. The front desk staff recognized me by name. I had worked alongside them for years. The residential suite occupied the top floor. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen with the same commercial countertops Frank had installed as a joke when we were designing the renovation. A terrace that looked over the harbor. On the kitchen table, Mr. Arsenault had left a pot of teas and shortbread from a bakery on Princess Street. I walked through every room slowly. There was no sunroom with drafty glass panels. There was no folder on the breakfast table, no locked door between me and the bathroom, no note taped above the light switch telling me to be quiet. I sat down and cried. Not for long. Frank had never liked when I cried without a reason, and the reasons I had today were reasons that needed to be acted on, not grieved over. 2 days later, I met with Miss Lapointe at her office on Johnson Street. She was methodical, quiet, and had handled our corporate legal work for 11 years. She laid out what had been established. Scott had requested a property valuation on Harbor Mill using Andrea's contact information, without my knowledge or authorization. The contractor estimate listed me as the funding source. A financing proposal, not yet submitted, included a projected family equity contribution of $280,000 attributed to the sale of my Kingston home. My signature appeared nowhere on any of these documents. Miss Lapointe removed me as the primary contact on all property inquiries and added written instructions to both properties. No family member could arrange a valuation, schedule a contractor, or discuss a sale in my name without my written consent, produced in her office. I also amended my estate. Piper and her brother Jamie, 10 years old, building his hockey rink in the backyard that I would never see finished. Each received education trusts, paid directly to their institutions outside their parents' access. A portion of the Harbor Mill rental income would support something that had begun forming in my mind on the second night, in the sunroom. When I had lain awake listening to windwork at the glass and thought about how many women my age found themselves in exactly this position. Redistributed, managed, made to feel that their comfort was a negotiable item in someone else's budget. I called it the Hollis Open Door Fund. We partnered with a housing cooperative in Kingston to set aside 4 units in a residential building near the hospital for women over 60 who needed transitional housing after bereavement or financial displacement. Each resident kept her own key. No family member could access the unit without her explicit written permission. I chose that clause myself. 6 weeks after I left Barrie, Andrea called on a Sunday at 8 o'clock. The time she had always called Frank and me in the years before his stroke. She said she had asked Scott to stay with his brother for a few weeks while they worked out what came next. "He thinks you engineered all of this," she said. "That you hid the building on purpose." I kept my finances private for 20 years. I wasn't hiding from Scott. I was protecting something that wasn't his to count. She was quiet then. I should have cleared the guest room. Yes. I should have said something when he put you in the sunroom. Yes. I didn't know how to disagree with him about money. I never did. I thought about that. It was probably true. Andrea had always deferred to the person in the room who seemed most certain. In our family, that had been Frank. Now it was Scott. It was a hard habit to recognize from inside it. "You know now," I said. "Mum," she said, "I'm sorry." It was the first time she named what she was sorry for without wrapping an explanation around it. I told her I believed her, which I did. In March, she brought Piper and Jamie to Kingston for a weekend. On Saturday morning, Piper came to the harbor mill alone on the bus and spent 3 hours in the suite, taking photographs of the harbor through the large windows, eating shortbread, and asking careful questions about the building. How did we decide on the renovation? Did we always want to keep the loading door frames? Did I think the commercial tenants downstairs were happy? I answered all of them. She was going to be interesting, that girl. She already was. At the opening ceremony for the first Hollis open-door unit in April, I stood in a small room with a large window and said nothing in particular. The building co-op manager handed the first resident her key, a woman named Carol, 74 years old, who had spent 8 months sleeping in her son's basement after her husband died, and her daughter-in-law had gradually, politely, taken over every room in the house. Carol unlocked the door. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the window, the single bed, the small table with one chair. "It's mine?" she asked. "It's yours," I said. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap. She did not cry immediately. She just looked around the room, with the careful attention of someone memorizing something they do not want to forget. I thought of the sunroom, the freezing glass, the wicker love seat, and the quilt that smelled of someone else's dog. I thought of the locked door and Andrea's voice in the morning saying it was just habit, just security, nothing personal. Everything had been personal. My comfort, my home, my assets, my future, all of it had been treated as negotiable, as eventually transferable, as a resource to be organized towards someone else's outcome. The $4 million had not saved me from any of that, but knowing I had it, knowing Harbor Mill was mine, knowing Ms. Lapointe had the documents, knowing Mr. Arsenault would answer when I called, had given me something more important than money. It had given me a room that was mine, not borrowed, not temporary, not contingent on what I agreed to next. There are women who do not have that. Women whose grief is an opening that someone else walks through first. Women who are moved from room to room and accept it, because the word family hangs over everything like a debt they have not finished paying. I had been one of them for 4 days, 4 cold January days on a wicker love seat. It turned out that was enough to build something from.